Jack has a sister-like female friend. Their relationship is so close they've shared the same bed and eaten the same ice cream. I asked them to maintain some distance. He impatiently replied, "If anything were going to happen, it would have happened long ago. Can we just trust each other a little?" Fine. I turned around and got myself a male best friend. When Jack once again spent the night out with Mary, I was surprisingly calm. He came back at noon with dim sum from Hung Fu Lu. Seeing me, he uncharacteristically took the initiative to explain, "It's been a while since we got together. We drank too much and ended up staying at a gaming hotel. But this time, we didn't share a bed. I slept on the floor." He emphasized this point, knowing that last time this issue had led to a huge fight between us. I had accused him of having no boundaries despite being married, and I insisted on confronting Mary. She was someone they had grown up with in the same courtyard. Although she's called a girl, her personality is carefree and tomboyish. I'd seen her multiple times sitting unabashedly on the laps of their guy friends, laughing and messing around, or even casually sharing the same glass of alcohol. At first, Jack would patiently explain, but eventually, he got fed up and slammed the door shut after leaving me with this. "If anything were going to happen, it would have happened long ago. And if it did, you wouldn't even have married me in the first place." The ridiculous part? His friends tried to console me. "Mary grew up with us. That's just her personality. Jack treats her like a little kid." A kid? Since when is 25 considered a kid? The whole thing left a bad taste in my mouth. I declared that if they didn't learn to keep their distance, I'd file for divorce. After that, Jack did maintain some space from Mary, but the result was her making snide remarks in public. "Sis-in-law, look, I'm not sitting next to Jack this time, right? Jack, maybe skip the next round of drinks with us. Don't want to upset sis-in-law. Jack isn't the same anymore. He's got a leash around his neck now, so I better keep my distance." She always said these things deliberately when I was present, which naturally created an awkward atmosphere. Over time, I gained a reputation as petty, jealous, and unreasonable. It was around then that Jack and I began to grow distant and estranged. I snapped back to reality, staring at the takeaway box in Jack's hands. It was once my favorite food, but now it tasted like nothing. Jack noticed my cold demeanor. He placed the box on the table and walked over to embrace me, his voice tinged with a rare tenderness. "Babe, didn't you say you wanted to see that movie? I'm not going to the office today. Let's go watch it together. It looks pretty good." It was a movie I had been looking forward to for months. As soon as it premiered, I had asked Jack to go with me. He said he was busy. A few days later, though, I saw a post on Mary's social media flaunting 2 movie tickets. Although neither face was shown, the hand with Jack's wedding ring was unmistakable. The faint scent of pear blossoms clung to Jack as I pushed him away, expressionless. "No need," I said, continuing to pack my suitcase. "Janny." His voice turned angry as he grabbed my arm, noticing my movements. "Leaving again? I already told you, there's nothing between me and Mary." "I know," I said calmly, pulling my hand free. "You're just like siblings." That seemed to catch him off guard. His expression shifted awkwardly as he furrowed his brows. "Then, what's your problem?" "I'm going on a business trip," I explained. His face darkened further as he stared at me, as though trying to discern some hidden motive, but there was none. My reaction was calm throughout because I no longer cared who he went to the movies with, who he spent the night out with, who he dated. It didn't matter anymore. Strangely, my indifference only seemed to make Jack angrier. He insisted on making amends, frantically searching for tickets on his phone. Finally, I couldn't hold back and softly reminded him that movie's no longer showing. His fingers froze on the screen. In that moment, I saw a flurry of emotions cross his face. The food on the table grew colder and colder. I bent down, packed the last item into my suitcase, and closed it. After that day, Jack suddenly became overly attentive. While I was away on my trip, he sent me morning and evening messages, asking persistently when I'd be back. The day I returned, as I exited the airport, I saw his car, a sleek black Bugatti, parked by the curb. When he spotted me, he quickly got out, Naturally taking my suitcase, it wasn't until we reached the car that I saw Mary in the front passenger seat. She sat there casually, legs crossed, one hand resting on the window. When she saw me, she smiled sweetly. "Sis-in-law, just hitching a ride. Don't worry, I'll let you have the passenger seat in a bit." Her carefree attitude was infuriating, and though she said she'd move, she made no effort to do so. Jack, now looking slightly uncomfortable, explained. She happened to be nearby. "It's on the way, so I offer to give her a ride. She gets car sick, so I let her take the front seat for this part of the drive." In past arguments, I had complained about how Mary always occupied the front seat whenever we traveled together, but before I could say anything, Mary poked her head out of the window with a mischievous grin and added, "Good thing Jack was nearby. Otherwise, I'd be stuck in the middle of nowhere." Don't believe me? The chat logs in our group prove it. That group, a group of childhood friends, did not include me. Of course, if Jack dares to ignore me, I'll go straight to our godparents to complain. Mary continued, playfully pretending to punch Jack in the chest. But midway, as if suddenly remembering something, she withdrew her hand and gave me a sheepish look, blinking nervously. "Sis-in-law, I'm just used to this kind of behavior. I swear I don't mean anything by it." Ever since the big fight between her and Jack last time, Mary had gone from being openly touchy-feely to a half-hearted attempt at self-restraint. It seemed like my constant vigilance had made her keep a deliberate distance from Jack. Yet, if she was truly trying to maintain that distance, then why did she end up sneaking out with him for late-night escapades and private meetings again? And why did I catch that fleeting yet unmistakable look of provocation in her eyes? This kind of petty game playing would have enraged me in the past, but now I couldn't be bothered. When Jack told Mary to get out of the car, I just waved him off and opened the back seat door. "Doesn't matter. I have a friend coming along too. We'll sit in the back together." "Friend? Where?" Before Jack could express his surprise, someone called out my name. I turned around, and my face instantly darkened. A flamboyantly dressed, broad-shouldered, slim-waisted man was jogging toward me, dragging a suitcase behind him. He stopped, looked at me with mock indignation, and said, "Janny, how could you ditch me like that?" I only turned away for a second to grab my suitcase. The man clung to my arm, feigning a pitiful expression. "I'm new here. You have to take care of me." This scene left both Jack and Mary momentarily stunned. Jack recovered quickly, grabbed my arm, and asked sharply, "This is the friend you mentioned?" His voice carried a hint of displeasure as he glared at the man, his furrowed brows practically forming a clamp. "Yeah, I'm Janny's bestie, Mars." Mars confidently shook hands with Jack and casually threw his suitcase into the trunk. He climbed into the back seat without hesitation and called out cheerfully, "Janny, hurry up and get in." I was about to get in when Jack stopped me. "Dear, it's inappropriate for a woman to sit with a man who's not her husband." He leaned in close, and I could almost hear the grinding of his teeth. "It's just a friend," I replied indifferently, glancing at Mary, who was still sitting comfortably in the front seat. For a moment, Jack was left speechless. Mars chatted with me the entire ride, making the front seat unusually quiet. It wasn't that Mary didn't try to talk. Her usual lively nature meant she'd often keep Jack entertained with stories from their childhood or neighborhood gossip. But today, no matter how much she tried, Jack responded only curtly. What should have been a 30-minute drive was over in 15. After dropping off the two passengers, Jack opened the front passenger door for me. "Come sit in the front," he said, and I glanced at him briefly but stayed put in the back. "I'm fine back here," I said, leaning back. "I'm tired. Let's just go home." The sound of the car door slamming shut was louder than usual. Jack stormed into the house, with a dark expression. By the time I finished changing my shoes and stepped out of the entryway, he was sitting in the living room, smoking a cigarette. The red glow of the cigarette reflected off his face, making his expression shift between shadow and light. "Who is that guy to you?" Jack took a long drag before extinguishing the cigarette forcefully and looking up at me. "A friend," I replied evenly. "A friend? A grown man over 6 feet tall, calling himself your bestie? Janny, is he the one you went on that business trip with? You were with him for days, just the two of you, weren't you?" Growing increasingly agitated, Jack kicked my suitcase hard. Anger flared within me. I opened the suitcase and, staring at his furious face, retorted, "Business partners are either male or female. He's easygoing, good company. Why can't he be my friend? Of course it's a problem. He's a man. How can a man be your bestie? Oh. So it's okay for you to have female buddies, but I can't have male ones." My words left him at a loss. For the first time, I saw a myriad of emotions flash across Jack's face: shock, regret, and frustration all at once. Finally, through gritted teeth, he managed, "Mary's different. We grew up together. If anything was going to happen, it would have happened already. And Mars and I are different too. Can't we trust each other a little?" My firm words cut him off. Jack had no comeback. For days afterward, he sulked in silence, barely speaking to me. A few days later, his parents invited us over for dinner. At the table, they picked up on the tension between us and subtly scolded Jack. "Jack, Janny gave up so much to marry you. You need to treat her well." Jack and I had been college sweethearts. As an only child, I was supposed to return home after graduation. But for him, I stayed in this city without hesitation. Hearing his parents' words, Jack's expression softened. On our way out, he reached for my hand. "Janny, Before he could finish, Mary appeared, slinging an arm around his neck. "Jack, you're back. Let's hang out." Once again, she showed no hesitation in draping herself over him. But this time, Jack didn't respond with his usual indulgent smile. Instead, he awkwardly brushed her arm away and glanced uneasily at me. Mary noticed and clicked her tongue in annoyance, deliberately stepping back into the arms of their group of friends. So it's sis-in-law," she said dramatically, taking a step back as if giving me space. The group erupted in teasing chatter, urging Jack to join them. I could see the temptation in his eyes. Unlike before, he didn't agree immediately. Instead, he looked at me for approval. The others noticed as well. Although we were married, Jack's circle of friends always maintained a subtle distance from me. Partly because I wasn't part of their group, and partly because of Mary. With me present at their gatherings, they couldn't completely let loose. "Why not join us for the gathering?" Jack asked tentatively. Almost simultaneously, I sensed the tension in the air. Mary's reaction was the most obvious, pouting and throwing meaningful glances at the others. Everyone seemed to be waiting for my response. They didn't want me to go, yet they hoped I would let Jack go. Yes, they wished. I pulled my hand out of Jack's and replied with a calm and gentle voice, "Then I'll just take a cab home by myself." Nobody said a word. The atmosphere grew awkwardly silent. After a long pause, Jack hesitated, appearing both relieved and guilty, and reassured me, "I'll come back early." I simply smiled, turned, and walked out of the courtyard. As I walked away, I heard someone blurt out, "Jack, has your wife changed? She's not jealous of Mary anymore? And she's letting you hang out with us?" At 11 p.m., Jack hadn't returned. I didn't ask him either. Instead, I met up with Mars and a group of friends, and we headed to the liveliest bar in town. The pounding music drowned out all thoughts, offering a fleeting sense of liberation. Our group settled into a spacious booth and quickly got into the mood. After a few rounds of drinks, someone next to me excitedly pointed to another table. "Whoa, that's wild over there." Everyone immediately perked up and turned to look. I followed their gaze and froze. It was Jack's group of childhood friends, a table of 7 men and 1 woman, with a pile of empty bottles on the table. Jack sat at the head, focused on his phone. Before long, Mary snatched the phone from his hand, then climbed onto his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck and holding up a bottle of alcohol. The rest of the table seemed unbothered, even cheering and egging her on. "Looks like they're playing King's game. Mouth-to-mouth drinking. This girl's a legend." Earlier, when asked to remove her bra, she whipped it off without hesitation and hung it around the guy next to her. Total boss move. 7 guys, 1 girl. That's something else. While everyone else laughed, I didn't. I watched as Jack put down his phone. Amid the cheering, he leaned forward, allowing Mary, holding a mouthful of alcohol, to lean in toward him. It was utterly disgusting. Mary didn't manage to complete her stunt, though, because I walked over and slapped her. The scene instantly turned ugly. Jack's friends tried to defuse the situation, insisting it was just a joke. Mary, on the other hand, looked aggrieved, claiming it was just part of the game. Unmoved, I grabbed the bra she had hung around another man's neck and threw it in her face before turning to leave. If you like playing games so much, wait until Jack and I are divorced, and you can play to your heart's content. I meant it. I was exhausted, but Jack disagreed. He followed me home, trying to explain himself. Sweetheart, we were just playing a game. Mary's always been like this. It's all just harmless fooling around. We don't even see her as a woman. All right, you're angry. I promise I won't mess around with them again in the future. Janny, I didn't say anything about you going to a bar with a bunch of guys. His attempts at appeasement turned into frustration. Finally, he grabbed his hair and shouted at me. By that point, I had packed my suitcase. I had too many belongings to take all at once, but I couldn't stand to stay under the same roof with him for even a second longer. Move, I said coldly, staring at his arm blocking my path. My gaze traveled upward to meet his face, my voice calm yet distant. True heartbreak doesn't come with shouting or crying. It's the moment when everything loses its meaning. Jack froze, visibly shaken by my expression. His tall frame stiffened, his face flushed with alcohol and darkened by frustration. You have to take things this far? He said through gritted teeth. Jack, would you accept me sitting on Mars's lap like that? I asked. He stiffened. I scoffed and took a step closer. You couldn't even handle us sharing a back seat during a work trip. You were so angry you gave me the cold shoulder for days. So why should I turn a blind eye to this? That's different, Jack blurted out. I'm a man and you're a woman. I wouldn't be taken advantage of out there. His words shattered me. For a moment, I felt like I didn't even know this person. My body trembled involuntarily, and I looked at him in disbelief. So, all this time you've known, I said, my voice shaking with suppressed anger. You knew Mary's behavior was inappropriate, shameless, disgusting. But because she's a woman, you enjoyed it? You felt accomplished taking advantage of her. Jack had no response. It was as if I'd torn away his last shred of dignity. His face turned pale, and he avoided my gaze. I laughed bitterly. Mars, I brought him around just to provoke you, I said. Jack's expression flickered with a brief glimmer of hope, but then I added, because at first, I thought you just didn't understand boundaries and wanted you to learn through experience. But I was wrong. You didn't misunderstand. You just enjoyed crossing those lines. With that, I shoved him aside. Jack, standing tall at over 6 feet, was caught off guard and fell to the ground. I paid no attention and said, Jack, let's get a divorce. Otherwise, I'll lose even more respect for you. Jack refused to divorce and even brought my parents into it. Jack had always left a good impression on my parents. Well-educated, good-looking, with highly accomplished parents, and having started his own company right after graduation, he also made a grand show of sincerity during our marriage. Naturally, my parents sided with him and tried to persuade me to reconsider, but that didn't last long, because Jack became infamous. The incident at the bar had been filmed by someone and posted online. Soon, the whole internet knew about Mary sitting on a married man's lap, attempting to feed him alcohol mouth to mouth, only to be slapped by his wife. Public opinion was overwhelmingly critical of Mary and Jack. Disgusting. She knew he was married and still threw herself at him. Not just him. She'd throw herself at anyone. Didn't you see her underwear hanging around another guy's neck? Damn, she's like public transport. Everyone's had a ride. And the guy? Gross. Surrounded by people and still not worried about catching something. Initially, Mary tried arguing with the netizens, calling them toxic and accusing them of projecting their dirty minds onto her. She insisted her relationship with Jack was nothing but innocent friendship between childhood buddies. The internet wasn't buying it. People started digging into her personal life and accounts, uncovering more and more. Photos and posts of her wearing her brother's clothes, sleeping in their beds, sharing drinks, holding hands, and even sneaking into a male-only spa wrapped in a towel to hang out with them. Her captions practically dripped with smugness. The exposure didn't stop with her. It pulled Jack and his whole childhood friend group into the spotlight. Every guy in the group with a girlfriend got dumped, And even the single ones found themselves unwelcome on the dating market. A meme went viral, dubbing them Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, with comments joking this was Snow White's darkest portrayal yet. Watching all this unfold gave me a sense of grim satisfaction. Mary had been like a cancer in my relationship with Jack, growing unchecked. I tried to remove her, but Jack had always dismissed my concerns. Now that cancer had backfired, and I had already distanced myself just in time. The scandal stayed on the headlines for days before disappearing, scrubbed clean overnight. Jack's group came from influential families, and their connections wiped all traces from the internet. Even Mary's accounts were completely erased. Shortly after, Jack's parents came to me, pleading. They begged me to visit Jack, who had been drinking himself into a stupor, so much so that he vomited blood. By the time he was rushed to the hospital, he was in a deep coma. It took an entire night to save his life, and even then, he lay pale and frail on the hospital bed, murmuring my name repeatedly. Janny, we know Jack was wrong this time, but for the sake of your marriage, could you please just go see him? Please, just once, for us, his parents implored. I went to the hospital. Jack looked haggard, his hospital gown hanging loosely on his thin frame. His face was as pale as paper, but when he saw me, a faint light of hope appeared in his otherwise lifeless eyes. I walked over and stopped him from trying to sit up. When will you be discharged? I asked flatly. His eyes lit up, and he managed to croak out. Next week. Janny, does this mean you're willing to forgive me? I swear, if you give me another chance, I'll cut ties with Mary completely. When you're discharged, we'll finalize the divorce. I interrupted, shattering his illusions. His face contorted in pain, beads of sweat streaming down his forehead as he gasped, his voice rough and desperate. Janny, I didn't cheat on you, and you know that. It was all just harmless fun. I promise I'll set boundaries from now on. Please don't leave me. When I didn't respond, Jack fell to the floor in a frantic attempt to stop me, knocking over his stand. The crash scattered medical equipment everywhere, dislodging the needle from his hand, which began bleeding profusely. It was chaotic and pitiful. Jack, who had always been proud and aloof, reduced to this state, once adored by women and confident in his charm, now kneeling before me in desperation. I should have been moved, but I wasn't. I simply stood there, looking down at him without a hint of compassion, and coldly said, "No." My indifference pierced Jack. I could see the pain and disbelief in his eyes, a glimmer of light fading as despair took over. Mary was the one who pursued us. Yes, I didn't stop her, but I never crossed the line. Why can't you just let it go? He shouted, his voice hoarse with frustration. His outburst caused his wounds to reopen, and blood began seeping through the bandages on his abdomen. The commotion quickly brought both our parents into the room. Upon witnessing the scene, the atmosphere became chaotic. Janny, Jack made a mistake, but the real culprit here is Mary. Jack only saw her as a sister. He was deceived. Jack's father stepped in to defend him. As the saying goes, it takes 100 years of fate to share the same boat, and 1,000 years to share the same pillow. You and Jack have come so far together. We've all seen it. Must it really end like this? I promise, as long as you and Jack don't divorce, the house, car, company, and savings will all be transferred to your name. If anything like this happens again, Jack will leave with nothing. Jack's father, who held absolute authority within their family, made this solemn guarantee. Unsurprisingly, my parents wavered. Janny, this time Jack's father seemed sincere. And Jack, he truly regrets what he's done. My mother whispered to me, and my father tried to argue, but was silenced with a sharp glare from her. She tugged at his ear and said, I know what you're thinking. We can take care of our daughter. But Janny's child needs a father. Yes, I was pregnant 1 month along. I had originally planned to terminate the pregnancy, but my parents had found out. For them, life was sacred above all else. Looking at Jack, they didn't say much, but their expressions softened compared to earlier. Clearly, they wanted to give him another chance. In the end, I agreed to give Jack one last chance. I told him that if he could stay completely out of contact with Mary for 1 month, I would reconsider the divorce. Both families bore witness to this agreement. Jack's face lit up, and he readily agreed, as though he believed my condition was a simple task. Both families visibly relaxed. But only I knew, this was a gamble Jack was destined to lose. Jack blocked Mary on all platforms.
He really did cut contact.
He left group chats, unfollowed accounts, and even showed me daily screenshots of his phone to assure me that everything was clean and proper. Mars was surprised when he heard about it. "Janny, are you seriously thinking of reconciling with your ex-husband?" he teased, his curiosity piqued. Despite his playful demeanor, Mars always kept a respectable distance from me. He knew about my problems with Jack and, after a few days away for work, offered me a serious solution: to fight fire with fire. Let Jack experience what it's like to have a brother-sister relationship with someone of the opposite sex. The results were strikingly effective, but now I fully understood that Mary was never the real issue in our marriage. Mars noticed my calm expression and looked concerned. "You're not actually considering reconciling, are you?" I remained composed and assured him, "The outcome won't change. I'm going through with the divorce." Perhaps thinking I had softened, both families believed I was beginning to compromise. However, after sending my parents home, I scheduled an appointment for the abortion. That day happened to be Mary's birthday. I only knew this because, as the only girl in their tight-knit group, her birthday was always a mandatory gathering, rain or shine. I deliberately chose that day, not out of spite, but because I didn't want Jack to interfere. Mars accompanied me to the clinic. On the way, he cried harder than I did. "I'm serious. Keep the child, and let the father go. I'll even adopt the baby myself if it comes to that. After all, I've already decided I'll never get married." Mars had once had a beloved first love, who tragically passed away when he was 20. Since then, he had used a playful, carefree persona to mask his pain, choosing to remain alone all these years. "Janny, won't you reconsider? I'll split the costs of raising the baby with you." Standing outside the operating room, he continued pleading, but I remained calm. I am myself first and foremost. Only then am I a mother. Mars fell silent, his expression a mix of frustration and helplessness. He nodded after a moment. "As your friend, I respect every decision you make. As a man, I understand your resolve to leave Jack." I forced a faint smile. I didn't need a mirror to know how bleak my expression must have been. Even though I had made up my mind, my eyes still welled up with tears as I turned away. My flat belly gave me no sense of being a mother, yet I admitted, this child had been the only reason I didn't immediately push for divorce. I wanted Jack to have the chance to truly feel what I had endured, but he failed to seize it. The anesthesia took effect, and I remembered nothing. Later, I was told I had gone through a life-or-death emergency. The patient is hemorrhaging heavily. "Family members, we need immediate consent for surgery." The doctor rushed out of the operating room, and Mars froze. The forms were thrust into his hands, but he couldn't sign them, not being a legal relative. "Can we leave it blank? Her parents aren't in town, and her husband, he's busy." "Are you kidding me? This is hospital policy. Call her husband now. The patient's condition is critical." The doctor's urgent tones snapped Mars out of his daze, and he frantically dialed Jack's number. 1 call, 2 calls, 3, 13, 33, 53, no answer. By the 53rd call, the phone was directly declined. Mars's initial panic turned to despair, and finally, to utter collapse. "Answer the phone. Jack, your wife is dying, and you're out celebrating some other woman's birthday." He screamed hysterically in the hospital hallway, drawing the attention of onlookers, doctors, nurses, and patients alike. They watched in shock and outrage, some joining in to curse Jack, others stepping in to help. Someone finally suggested, "If you can't reach him, call someone who can." The word struck Mars like lightning. He used my phone to dial another number. Jack arrived 15 minutes later, with my in-laws in tow. He was covered in cake and cream, his tie hanging loosely around his neck, his shirt collar open, and his hair wet and disheveled. "This is what Mars told me after I woke up. You were born with a thin uterine lining, which caused severe bleeding. Fortunately, the rescue was timely, and in the end, your uterus was saved." Mars said, Marveling at my luck, Di, however, remained expressionless and asked, "Is Jack still kneeling outside?" This time, Jack was kneeling at the door of the hospital room, and no one interceded for him. Even my in-laws, knowing they were in the wrong, stayed silent. After the surgery, my mother-in-law tried to comfort me for a long time. Before leaving, she held my hand reluctantly, her eyes filled with guilt. "Janny, you've endured so much since marrying into this family. My son, he's beyond saving," she said, her voice trembling. "If you want a divorce, we won't try to stop you anymore. Follow your heart." Snapping back to the present, I met Mars's complicated gaze and said calmly, "Help me out of here." Mars wanted to persuade me otherwise but couldn't. He had no choice but to help me into a wheelchair and push me toward the door. In the hallway, Jack was kneeling upright, still dressed in his crumpled suit from earlier in the day. A bruise marred his cheekbone. Mars's handiwork. Jack hadn't fought back despite the public humiliation. Even now, with people coming and going, Jack, who usually despised being watched, hadn't budged an inch. When he saw me, his face was a mix of pain and sorrow. Before he could speak, I tossed a document at him. "You've lost," I said succinctly, those 3 words making his face go pale. The noisy corridor buzzed with murmurs from onlookers, but none of it drowned out his labored breathing. Without even glancing at the document on the ground, he fixed his eyes on me. Being the sharp man he was, Jack quickly sensed something was off. "You deliberately chose today to force me into a decision, to make me regret," he muttered, his voice growing more pained as he spoke. Finally, he punched his temple hard and I rolled my eyes. "You're overthinking it. No matter what choice you made, I wouldn't keep this child." My voice was weak, my body leaning against the wall for support. "I know very well. You can't do it." Even though the task was simple. Just 1 month of no contact with Mary, but even such a simple thing, Jack couldn't manage. "Mary saved our lives back in elementary school, so we promised her we'd always reunite for her birthday," he said helplessly. Back in 3rd grade, Jack and his gang had a wild idea to go on an adventure. They found a shipping container to spend the night in, only to wake up the next morning high in the sky, teetering dangerously. Thankfully, Mary, who had secretly followed them, alerted adults in time to save them. From then on, Mary became a part of their group, their treasured little sister. But their affection for her was their business. Jack eventually agreed to the divorce. The formalities were completed, and after the mandatory cooling-off period, we walked out of the Civil Affairs Bureau. His face looked like he was attending a funeral. Unwilling to give up, Jack begged me for another chance, claiming he wanted to atone, that he still loved me. His tall frame was hunched over, as if his spine might snap from the weight of his regret. From pleading to relentless pestering, he wouldn't let go. During one of these exchanges, neither of us noticed that we had stepped onto the road. Nor did we notice a red BMW speeding directly toward me. Bang! Everything happened too fast. By the time I reacted, Jack had already been flung into the air in front of me. It felt like a slow-motion scene from a movie. The last thing he said before being thrown was, "I'm sorry." In that moment, my heart stopped. It wasn't until I heard the heavy thud of his body hitting the ground that I snapped back to reality. I rushed toward him. At the same time, Mary stormed out of the passenger seat. When she saw that the person who had been hit was Jack, she lost it completely, screaming hysterically. She shouted that I should die and came at me with a knife in hand. Before Mary could do anything, a patrolling officer quickly pinned her against the car hood and took the knife out of her hand. "Janny, why don't you just die? If it weren't for you, how could they all have cut ties with me? It's all because of you, you wretch. I'll kill you." Mary had completely lost it. On the day of my surgery, my in-laws had gone to her place, only to find Jack there with his childhood friends. Enraged, they cut ties with Mary and pressured several families in the circle to sever ties with hers as well. To calm things down, Mary's family decided to sacrifice her, sending her abroad and forbidding her from ever returning. Her once loyal group of family heirs, who had treated her as their cherished mascot, immediately distanced themselves when their own interests were threatened. For Mary, this was her darkest moment. And she believed I was the one to blame. She thought that if I died, everything could go back to the way it was. Listening to her rants, I found the whole thing absurd. Jack survived but was left partially paralyzed. Mary wasn't sentenced to death, but was convicted of intentional harm and given a life sentence. In prison, her face was reportedly slashed and disfigured for reasons unknown. After Jack's accident, many people came to talk to me, his parents, his friends, my parents. His parents pleaded with me not to leave Jack during such a difficult time, out of consideration for our past as husband and wife. His friends asked me to stay, reminding me of how he had saved my life. My parents urged me to come home and stop bringing trouble upon myself. Eventually, I went to see Jack, the proud man he once was. Now lay in a hospital bed, completely dependent on others for even the most basic needs. He didn't speak but looked at me with eyes full of regret. I thanked him because, after all, he had saved my life. I know I don't have the right to ask you to stay. Jack choked out, his voice hoarse and filled with pain. All of this. I brought it on myself. It's my punishment. The doctors haven't given you a death sentence, I said calmly. If you cooperate with treatment, you still have a chance to walk again. Hearing this, Jack's eyes lit up with a flicker of hope. Nervously and cautiously, he asked, "So, does that mean you're willing to?" "I've already decided to return to my hometown," I interrupted. "You know I'm an only child. If it weren't for you, I would have gone back home to build my career right after graduation." My tone was steady, without a hint of hesitation. In that moment, I saw the light in Jack's eyes fade. He looked like a sunflower that had lost its vitality, his eyes red and his bitter smile tinged with self-mockery. I knew it. Someone like me, someone useless like this. I'm destined to rot in the mud for the rest of my life. "Jack, we each have our own lives," I said, cutting off his self-pity. "You can no longer affect me, and I shouldn't affect you anymore." Perhaps it was the sharpness in my gaze, piercing directly into his heart, but the room fell silent, so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. The sunlight streaming through the window bathed me in golden light, as if wrapping me in a glowing mantle. I returned to my hometown. Occasionally, I still heard news from South City. Jack took 2 years to walk again. But the delay in his recovery had caused his company to falter, and in the end, it had to shut down. Another year passed, and it was New Year's Eve. Mars texted me, "Happy New Year." I was helping my parents make dumplings at the time. Wiping the flour off my hands, I opened his message and saw a selfie of him sitting alone on a balcony. I couldn't help teasing him. "Spending New Year's alone again? If it's really that bad, you can come to my parents' place. They'll take you in for a few days." He quickly replied, "No thanks. My girlfriend wouldn't be happy about that." He was referring to his first love, who had passed away many years ago. Raising an eyebrow, I replied, "Impressive. Still upholding those manly virtues after all these years." "Of course. Even besties need boundaries," he wrote back. I laughed, looking up at the window. Snow had begun to fall, blanketing the world outside in a serene beauty.